In 1487, something took place in Tenochtitlan that no civilization had ever attempted at this scale. For 4 straight days, lines of captives stretched from the base of the Great Temple, spilling out through the causeways and into the surrounding lake towns. The lines never broke. The number recorded by the Aztecs themselves was 84,000. 84,000 people across 4 days. Historians have argued over that figure ever since. Some call it exaggerated. Some settle on 20,000. Some believe the real count was even greater. But nobody disputes what those people were brought there for. And nobody disputes what happened to every single one of them. You think you already know this story. You've seen it in Apocalypto. The chase, the capture, the stone altar, the knife, a body tumbling down the steps. That version was built for a 2-hour film. The real version stretched across months, sometimes an entire year, because the Aztecs didn't simply kill their captives. That would have been fast. That would have been straightforward. And nothing about this system was designed for speed. Certain prisoners were fed the finest food the empire could offer. They were dressed in gold, taught to play musical instruments, given companions, given names that did not belong to them. They were worshipped. People in the streets bowed as they passed, touched their skin, prayed to them as living gods. And then, on a date calculated months in advance by priests who had spent their lives tracking the stars, every piece of that constructed identity was stripped away. The gold, the name, the deity they had been shaped into, all of it removed. What remained wasn't a god. It was a man standing at the foot of a temple with nowhere to go except up. His ankles would be tethered. His weapon would be lined with feathers instead of obsidian. Standing across from him would be 4 of the most decorated warriors in the empire, carrying real blades. The crowd would watch him fight a battle that had already been decided before it started. But that moment was months away. Right now, he was standing on a field outside a city he had never seen. And someone was moving toward him. To understand what the Aztecs did to their captives, you first have to understand how they obtained them. Because they didn't acquire people the way other empires did. There were no slave raids, no ambushes along trade roads. There were appointments. The Aztec Triple Alliance, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, would dispatch messengers to enemy cities. Not to demand surrender. To schedule a battle. A date, a location, an agreed number of warriors from each side. These were the Xochiatl, the Flower Wars. And the first thing you have to understand about them is this. They were not fought to take territory. They were not fought to destroy armies. They were fought to collect people. Living people. A Tlaxcalan fighter walking onto a flower war field understood that the man across from him was not trying to kill him. He was trying to grab him, pin him, drag him off the field breathing, because capturing an enemy alive was the single highest measure of status in Aztec society. Not killing. Capturing. A warrior who brought back captives earned the right to specific garments, access to military councils, eligibility for the highest warrior orders in the empire. The entire military hierarchy rested on one metric. How many living people had you personally seized? This created something historians have struggled to place into any familiar category. A military system where dying in battle wasn't the worst outcome. A dead enemy couldn't be marched back to Tenochtitlan. Couldn't be painted. Couldn't be presented at the temple. Couldn't feed what the system demanded. So the Macuahuitl, the obsidian-edged club, wasn't swung to kill on those fields. It was swung to break a leg or tear open a shoulder just enough to drop a man without finishing him. Then drag him off the field, bind him, and begin the march back to the capital. That march could take days. Sometimes weeks. The captive was guarded but not starved, not beaten, because what waited for him in Tenochtitlan required him to arrive intact. The first thing a captive saw when he entered the city was the temple. It was visible from every approach, across the causeways, from the lake, from every street that fed into the ceremonial center. 45 meters high, its stairs darkened by old blood. He knew what happened at the top. Everyone knew. What he didn't yet know was whether he was going to the top or somewhere else entirely. Not all captives were equal, and the Aztecs had a precise system for determining who went where. The first factor was the warrior who had captured them. His rank, his record, his standing within his order. These determined the captive's initial value. The second factor was the captive himself. His size, his bearing, his visible condition, whether he had fought well on the field or gone down quickly, whether he had held his composure during the march or shown signs of breaking. All of it was observed, recorded, and weighed. Because different rituals required different kinds of people. Some ceremonies needed large groups. Dozens. Hundreds. These captives moved through the system quickly. Their fate came within days, sometimes hours of arrival. They climbed the steps of the Templo Mayor. What happened at the top followed the pattern that most people already know. The obsidian knife, the chest opened, the heart removed still beating, the body sent rolling down the steps, the next captive stepping forward. This was the version that operated at scale. The version responsible for those 4-day numbers in 1487. But it wasn't the only version. Some captives were pulled aside. Not for the mass ceremonies. For something that took considerably longer. These individuals were selected according to criteria controlled entirely by the priests. Physical appearance mattered. Symmetry, skin condition, age. A specific kind of composure that the sources describe but never fully define. Something in the way a captive carried himself that made him suitable for a different role entirely. These men were not sent to the temple steps. They were sent to the Karmikak, the priestly schools. And what happened to them there had no equivalent anywhere else in the ancient world. The selected captive was cleaned. His war paint was removed. His hair was washed and restyled. His body was prepared with specific treatments the sources attribute to the priests. Then he was dressed, not in prisoner garments, not in rags, in the ceremonial clothing of a god. Each major deity in the Aztec pantheon carried a distinct visual identity. Tezcatlipoca wore obsidian mirrors and a specific pattern of face paint. Totec was associated with garments of flayed skin. Huitzilopochtli was marked with hummingbird feathers and a particular shade of blue. The selected captive was made to look exactly like the deity he had been assigned to. He became what the Aztecs called an Ixiptla, a living image. Not a representative, not a performer playing a role. In Aztec theological understanding, the Ixiptla was the god. Not symbolically, literally. The moment the clothing went on, the identity shifted. The captive's name was replaced by the god's name. Those who addressed him used divine titles. When he moved through the streets, the people around him did not see a prisoner wearing a costume. They saw something sacred. They knelt. They brought offerings. They asked for blessings. Children were carried to him. And this continued for months. The most thoroughly documented version of this process involved the Ixiptla of Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, one of the most significant figures in the Aztec theological system. This particular captive lived as Tezcatlipoca for close to a full year. During that year, he was taught to play the flute. Not just to hold it, to play it well. He was given 4 female companions, themselves selected and prepared for their roles, who remained with him through the final weeks. He walked through the city without restraint. He ate the food of nobility. He received flowers, incense, and gold ornaments that he wore in public. From the outside, it appeared to be the most privileged existence any captive could receive. But here is what was happening beneath all of it. The priests watched him continuously. Not to prevent escape, there was nowhere to go. Tenochtitlan was an island city connected to the mainland by causeways, and every causeway was under control. They watched for something else. His demeanor. His willingness. Whether the transformation was holding. Because the entire ritual depended on a single outcome that no amount of force could guarantee. When the appointed day arrived, the captive had to walk to his death of his own accord. Not dragged. Not bound. Not pushed up the steps by guards. He had to climb them himself. He had to break the flutes he had played for months, one on each step as he ascended. He had to reach the top composed. And he had to lie down on the stone without being forced. This is the element historians have spent decades trying to account for. Some argue it was psychological conditioning, that months of worship gradually reshaped the captive's sense of self until he no longer experienced himself as a prisoner, that by the time the day came, he had ceased to think of the man he had been before. Others point out that resistance was functionally meaningless. Surrounded by thousands of people on an island with no weapon and no ally, what could opposition accomplish? The ending was not in question. The only variable was how a man arrived at it. A third interpretation, and the one the sources seem to support most directly, is that the Aztecs had identified something about identity that modern psychology would later begin to formalize. If you treat a person as something else, consistently, within a total environment, with complete social reinforcement from every direction, they begin to inhabit that thing. Not necessarily because they believe it. Because the line between performance and identity wears down until it disappears. The Xiptla didn't need to believe he was a god. He only needed to stop believing he was still a captive. And months of gold, music, worship, and physical comfort were sufficient to accomplish that. But there was one thing the system could never fully dissolve. The captive always knew the date. The festival calendar was public information. Everyone in Tenochtitlan knew when Tezcatlipoca's ceremony fell. The captive living inside the god's identity knew it too. Every day of comfort arrived with a countdown attached to it. The sources record something the priests monitored carefully in the final weeks. Some Xiptla grew quiet. They stopped playing the flute. They stopped engaging with their companions. They didn't resist. They didn't try to run. They simply withdrew. The priests had a term for this state. It translates roughly as the god grows heavy. When it occurred, the ritual continued regardless. Not every captive was made into a god. Some were given something that appeared, from a distance, like an opportunity. The festival of Tlacaxepehualistli, the flaying of men, was among the most widely attended events in the Aztec ceremonial year. It honored Totec, the deity connected to agricultural renewal, spring, and the shedding of old skin. At the center of the ritual was the Tenochtitlan, a massive circular stone carved and positioned in an open public space where hundreds, sometimes thousands, could observe without obstruction. The captive was brought to this stone and tethered to it by the waist. The rope was long enough to allow movement but short enough to remove any possibility of departure. Then he was handed a weapon. A macuahuitl, but not a functional one. The obsidian blades had been removed and replaced with feathers. The weapon carried the correct shape, the correct weight, the correct appearance from 20 rows back. A spectator at a distance might not notice the difference. The man holding it knew the moment his hand closed around it. This was not a weapon. This was a prop. Then the opponents came. Eagle warriors. Jaguar warriors. The highest-ranked fighters in the empire. Men who had personally seized dozens of captives. Men whose entire standing had been built through combat. They came carrying real macuahuitl with real obsidian edges, real shields, full regalia. And there were multiple of them. The captive faced them one at a time, but when one stepped back, another stepped forward, fresh against exhausted, armed against feathered wood, unbound against tethered. The crowd watched every moment of it. This was not a hidden ceremony conducted behind closed walls. It was public theater. Nobles attended. Allied rulers were given seats. Representatives from rival states, states that might one day send their own warriors to this same stone, were placed where they could see clearly. They watched what happened to captives of the Triple Alliance. They were intended to watch. Some captives collapsed quickly. Overwhelmed by the gap between their situation and their opponents, they went down within minutes. The ritual moved on. But others fought. And this is where the system revealed its second function. Because if a captive fought with skill, if he lasted, if he drew blood, if he managed to wound one of the elite warriors standing across from him, the crowd did not react with discomfort. They responded with approval. A strong captive elevated the ritual. He demonstrated that the Empire's enemies were formidable, which in turn confirmed that the Empire's warriors were more formidable still for having taken him. The captive's resistance didn't challenge the system. It reinforced it. And then there was Tlahuicol, a Tlaxcalan war captain captured during a flower war engagement. The sources describe him as physically exceptional, tall, experienced, and clearly different from the typical captive arriving in Tenochtitlan. When he was brought to the capital, something unusual was offered to him. The emperor, Moctezuma I or Moctezuma II, depending on which account you follow, gave him a choice. He could return to Tlaxcala. He could also, if he preferred, serve as a military commander in the Aztec army, lead campaigns against other enemies, live in the capital with rank and real standing. Tlajüecol refused both options. He chose the Temalacatl. The sources are clear about this. They are less clear about his reasoning. Later interpretations suggest that returning home as a captive who had been released, rather than one who had escaped or been recovered through military pressure, represented a form of social destruction that was worse to him than the physical version. Others suggest his own cultural framework demanded it. Among Tlaxcalan warriors, being captured was already a failure. Returning afterward, carrying the additional weight of having accepted mercy from the people who took you, would have been a specific and lasting kind of shame. Whatever drove the decision, Tlajüecol stepped onto the Temalacatl voluntarily. He was tethered, handed the feathered weapon, and according to the accounts that survived, he fought. Not briefly. He wounded multiple eagle warriors. Some sources say he killed one, though this remains disputed. He held the stone longer than any captive those present could remember. The crowd watched a man deliberately fight a battle he had chosen to lose. When he finally fell, the ritual continued, because the ritual always continued. No matter what the captive did, no matter how he performed, the ending was fixed. What happened to the body afterward is the part the sources describe with the least ambiguity and the most detail. It was taken by the warrior who had originally captured him. That was his right. The captor carried specific ritual responsibilities that extended beyond the death. What those responsibilities involved is documented in the codices. And what they describe is the origin of the festival's name. The flaying of men. Every visiting ruler who watched a captive swing a weapon lined with feathers against warriors carrying obsidian understood the message without requiring a translation. This is what your warriors will face if they resist. This is how your strongest men will end. And this is what your people will become. Offerings dressed in gold, walking willingly toward a stone they cannot leave. That was the purpose of the system. Not religion alone. Not military tradition alone. Infrastructure. The flower wars were scheduled, recurring, and diplomatically arranged. The supply of captives was managed rather than incidental. The selection process inside Tenochtitlan was standardized and consistent. The sorting of captives into different ritual categories operated like a bureaucracy rather than a spontaneous religious impulse. The Xipla process consumed months of preparation, resources, and sustained attention from the priestly class. The gladiatorial combat on the Temalacatl was staged in front of foreign dignitaries. It was a message delivered through spectacle. The system accomplished three things simultaneously. It sustained the religious apparatus that legitimized Aztec authority. Every ceremony confirmed that the gods endorsed the empire. Every heart removed at the Templo Mayor was evidence that the cosmic order persisted because the Aztecs maintained it. Below that, it kept the warrior class active, competitive, and ranked. Without regular combat, there was no mechanism for advancement. Without captives to bring home, the status system had nothing to operate on. The entire structure of social mobility depended on a continuous supply of living enemies. Peace was not a stable condition within this framework. Peace was stagnation dressed in different clothing. And beneath both of those layers was the political function. The public spectacles were attended by precisely the people the empire needed to manage. Tributary states, trade partners, border communities calculating whether resistance was worth the cost. They watched. They performed their own calculations. And they stayed. Not because the Aztecs were undefeatable. Tlaxcala demonstrated they could be held to a standstill. But because the cost of being captured had been so specifically, so elaborately, and so publicly demonstrated that most leaders concluded submission was the less expensive choice. The rituals were not worship that happened to carry political implications. They were politics that operated through worship. And the captives at the center of all of it, the men who were fed, dressed, trained, worshipped, handed useless weapons, and killed on schedule, they were the raw material the machine required to function. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they encountered an empire built on captives. Cortés didn't fully understand what he was looking at. His translators did their best to explain it. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, one of the soldiers who documented the conquest, described the temple precincts of Tenochtitlan in detail that still carries the weight of genuine shock. The walls darkened by accumulated blood. The smell that didn't leave. The skull racks, the tzompant li, organizing thousands of remains into rows and columns. Archaeological excavation at the Templo Mayor site has since confirmed these racks existed at the scale the Spanish recorded. The numbers were not invented. But what Cortés and his men grasped immediately, something the Aztecs' neighbors had understood for generations, was that the system had a structural dependency. It required enemies who could be captured but never fully absorbed.
Tlaxcala,
Huexotzinco, Cholula. These states existed in a condition of permanent managed conflict with the Triple Alliance. They were never conquered outright, never destroyed, never brought fully inside the empire. Because if they were, the Flower Wars would stop. And if the Flower Wars stopped, the captives stopped. And if the captives stopped, the ceremonies couldn't be sustained. The warriors had no path forward. The gods went and fed. The political theater that held tributary states in place could no longer be performed. The system required its enemies to remain enemies. That was not a flaw in the design. It was a feature of it. This is what Cortés understood when he moved on Tenochtitlan. He didn't make that march with 500 Spaniards. He made it with tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan soldiers who had spent generations being fed into the machine. They didn't align with the Spanish because they admired European civilization. They aligned because they had watched their brothers, their sons, their war captains ascend those steps. And they wanted it to stop. Apocalypto shows a man running. That's the version cinema can hold. The chase, the desperation, the final sprint to the water's edge. The real system didn't chase. It invited. It dressed its captives in gold and addressed them as gods. It gave them music, food, companionship, and reverence. It allowed them to move freely through the most sophisticated city in the Western Hemisphere. And then it asked them to climb the steps themselves. The prisoners of the Aztec Empire were not hunted. They were processed, sorted, assigned a function, and made to perform that function until the calendar indicated otherwise. The man on the Tenochtitlan, swinging a club lined with feathers at warriors carrying obsidian, was not fighting for survival. He was completing a role inside a system that had already determined his ending. And when he fell, the next man stepped forward.